Welcome back to the channel. It was close to midnight when the gunshot cracked across the quiet farmland of Willow Creek, a small town that most people never stopped in, let alone remembered. The sound was sharp, echoing across the fields, carried by the wind until it reached the cluster of houses at the edge of town. Dogs barked, porch lights flicked on. A few neighbors stepped outside, pulling coats over their NIGHTCLOTHEs. The gunshot had come from the Harker farmhouse, an aging, two-story structure leaning slightly as though the earth beneath it had grown tired of holding the weight. It had always been the subject of whispered conversations at the diner and the barber shop. Not just because it was old or because its paint peeled like shedding skin, but because of a man who lived there. Daniel Harker. That night, the sheriff's phone rang off the hook. Within 10 minutes, he was bumping down the dirt road toward the farmhouse, headlights cutting through the fog. When he arrived, he found the front door wide open and Daniel standing in the doorway, a revolver trembling in his hand, smoke still curling from the barrel. His face was as pale as the moon above him. "She was here," he whispered hoarsely, his voice shaking. "I shot her. I had to. But there was no body, no intruder, no woman, only the echo of a gunshot that would haunt the town for years to come." Daniel Harker had been a soldier once, a long time ago, in the jungles of Vietnam, where every snapped twig could mean death, and every night was filled with the weight of unseen eyes. He returned home with scars on his body and deeper scars in his mind, though the town of Willow Creek didn't talk about that. They talked about how he kept to himself, how his farmhouse looked abandoned even though he lived inside it, and how his eyes seemed to stare through people rather than at them. He was 53 now, though he looked closer to 60. His hands were calloused from years of working the land, but the crops never grew quite right. He had let the barn rot, the fences sag, and the paint peel from the house. Inside, the farmhouse was a museum of neglect. Yellowed wallpaper curling at the edges, furniture sunken with age, and photographs of people long gone. One photograph he kept in the kitchen was of his wife, Margaret. She had died 10 years earlier, cancer taking her slowly, painfully. Daniel had been with her until the end, holding her hand as she slipped away. After she was gone, the house seemed to grow colder, emptier. He would sometimes sit in his chair at night and swear he heard her voice calling from upstairs. The town thought of him as strange, but mostly harmless. Children whispered about the haunted Harker place, daring each other to step onto the porch at night. Adults shook their heads, saying Daniel was a broken man, best left alone. But when the gunshot rang out that night, they began to wonder if maybe the whispers had been true all along. Willow Creek wasn't much more than a crossroads where a pair of faded highways met. A gas station, a diner with flickering neon lights, a hardware store, a church, and a sheriff's office that looked more like a tool shed. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets had a way of leaking through walls no matter how tightly you sealed them. People talked. They always had Dot at the diner. Gossip ran thicker than the coffee. Old men in ball caps muttered that Daniel was touched in the head. Women lowering their voices wondered if maybe he drank too much, if maybe he had turned mean. The younger folks barely knew him at all. He never came to town unless he needed supplies. He was a man out of place, out of time. Sheriff Reed had known Daniel since high school. He remembered the boy who had gone off to war, returned gaunt and hollow-eyed, and married Margaret soon after. Reed pitied him, but pity only went so far. The sheriff had seen enough trouble in his years to know that when a man started firing guns at shadows, it usually didn't end well. Then there was Reverend Collier, the town's priest. He visited Daniel once a year around Christmas, bringing bread and company. He said the man had a good heart, but a house like that, so full of silence and grief, was the kind of place where darkness liked to settle. Still, nobody in Willow Creek expected violence from Daniel. They expected loneliness, maybe madness, but not a gunshot echoing at midnight on the night of the shooting. The farmhouse stood under a sickle moon. The field stretched quiet and empty, the wind whispering through brittle stalks of corn left too long unharvested. Daniel sat in his armchair, revolver resting on the side table, a glass of whiskey untouched at his elbow. He had grown used to the noises of the old house creaks, groans, the scratch of branches against the windows. But lately, there had been something else. Footsteps, light, deliberate, pacing steps in the hallway upstairs. He had climbed the stairs with his gun more than once, flicked on every light, found nothing but dust and shadows. Yet the sound kept returning, always when the night was at its deepest. At night, he heard something different, a voice, soft, almost tender, drifting down the staircase. Daniel. It froze his blood. The voice was Margaret's, his wife's voice. But Margaret was buried in Willow Creek Cemetery beneath a weather-stained stone Daniel visited only on her birthday. The voice came again, stronger this time. Daniel, come upstairs. His hand shook as he grabbed the revolver. The hallway stretched before him, the air colder than it should have been, the shadows deeper. At the far end, near the open doorway to their old bedroom, he saw her Margaret. She was standing there, pale as smoke, her nightgown flowing as though stirred by a breeze that wasn't there. Her face was both beautiful and wrong, her eyes too. Dark, her skin too thin. Come to me, she whispered. Daniel raised the revolver. His breath came ragged. You're not her, he rasped. You can't be. The figure tilted its head. It smiled with lips that looked like Margaret's, but stretched wider than they should. That was when Daniel pulled the trigger. The gunshot split the night, echoing through the farmhouse and across the fields. The figure staggered back, a sharp cry ripping from its throat. For one terrible instant, Daniel swore he saw blood bloom across its chest. But then the figure flickered like smoke caught in a draft and vanished. When the sheriff arrived minutes later, Daniel was still standing there, revolver in hand, muttering the same words over and over. I shot her. I shot the ghost. Asterisk sheriff. Reed stood in Daniel's kitchen, hat in hand, trying to make sense of what he saw. The gun still smoked faintly on the table. Daniel's face was clammy, his shirt damp with sweat, his eyes wide as though he had glimpsed hell itself. There was someone here, Daniel insisted, voice ragged. Margaret. It was Margaret. The sheriff frowned. Margaret's been gone 10 years. Daniel slammed his fist on the table hard enough to rattle the glasses. I know she's dead, Reed. Don't you think I know that? But she was here. Tonight, I swear to God she was, and I shot her. Reed glanced around the room. No body, no broken glass, no sign of forced entry. He sighed, already imagining the talk that would spread through town. Then Deputy Carson called from the hallway. Sheriff, you better see this. They followed him upstairs to the bedroom at the end of the hall. On the wooden floorboards, dark stains pooled in irregular patterns. Reed crouched down, touched one with his finger, and brought it to his. Nose. Blood. Fresh. But there was no body, no footprints leading away. Just the impossible fact of blood without a source. What do you make of that? Carson muttered, uneasy. Reed didn't answer. He looked at Daniel, whose trembling hands clutched the doorframe. I told you, Daniel whispered. I shot her. The sheriff wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to a trick of Daniel's broken mind. But the blood was real. Too real. And something in Daniel's eyes told him the man wasn't lying, not entirely. The next morning, Willow Creek buzzed with the story. By noon, everyone knew Daniel had fired his gun inside the old farmhouse and claimed he'd shot his dead wife. The details twisted with every retelling. Some swore he'd killed an intruder and hidden the body. Others whispered he'd lost his mind and fired at nothing. Reverend Collier came by that afternoon. The priest's hair had gone white, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped his Bible. He sat with Daniel at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the dirty window. "You believe me, don't you, Reverend?" Daniel asked, voice pleading. Collier hesitated. "I believe you saw something, and I believe your grief has left you vulnerable. Sometimes, when the soul cries out, other things listen." Daniel frowned. "Other things?" "There are spirits that linger," the priest said quietly. "But not all of them are who they appear to be. Some wear familiar faces to get close, to draw you in." Daniel's skin prickled at the words. He remembered the smile, too wide, too wrong. That evening, as Collier left, a stranger appeared at the edge of the yard. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a coat that looked too heavy for the warm weather. He introduced himself as Thomas Gray, a drifter, passing through, but his eyes lingered on the farmhouse longer than seemed natural. "You've seen her, haven't you?" Gray asked Daniel, his voice low and steady. Daniel stiffened. "What did you say?" "The woman," Gray continued. "Pale skin, dark eyes, looks like someone you loved." Daniel's heart pounded. "How the hell would you know that?" Gray smiled grimly. "Because I've seen her too, not just here." "She doesn't belong to you, Harker. She doesn't belong to anyone." That thing wears faces, but it's not a woman. It's older, meaner, and if you shot it... After Thomas Gray's warning, Daniel couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house made him twitch. He found himself digging through old boxes in the attic, searching for something, anything that might explain what he'd seen. What he found were newspapers. Yellowed clippings stuffed into a box left behind by the farmhouse's previous owners. Stories he'd never bothered to read when he bought the place years ago. The headlines chilled him. Local woman, missing, last seen at Harker farmhouse. Family flees home claiming evil presence. Unexplained death shrouds property in mystery. One article, dated 1932, described a woman named Eleanor Price who had vanished after renting a room in the farmhouse. Her fiancé swore he saw her waving from an upstairs window weeks after her disappearance. Even though the police insisted she was gone, another article from the 1950s told of the Carters, a young couple who moved in with 2 children. Within a year, the wife was found wandering the fields at night, claiming she heard voices calling her name. The children spoke of a woman in white who stood at the foot of their beds. Eventually, the family abandoned the house, leaving everything behind. Daniel sat on the dusty floor of the attic, his hands shaking as he read. The pattern was always the same. A figure appearing, wearing familiar faces, whispering in the dark. Always drawing people deeper into madness. The farmhouse had been haunted long before he ever set foot inside. The nights grew worse. At first, it was just whispers. Then came the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, moving through the hallways. When Daniel knew he was alone, he boarded up the windows, nailed the door shut, but the sounds came from inside, not outside. One night, he woke to the smell of smoke. Heart pounding, he rushed downstairs, gun in hand. The kitchen was empty, no fire, burning. But on the table sat an ashtray, and in it, a cigarette smoldered, still warm, still lit. Daniel hadn't smoked in over a decade. Another night, he found muddy footprints across the living room floor, bare feet, too small to be his. They led to the staircase and stopped halfway up, vanishing as though the figure had disappeared mid-dash step. Sleep became impossible. He dozed in his chair with the revolver across his lap, jerking awake at every sound. His eyes sank deeper into his skull. His hands shook constantly. The whiskey bottle grew lighter by the day. Neighbors began to notice. They saw him in town, muttering to himself, eyes darting as though watching something no one else could see. Some avoided him altogether. Others whispered that he was cursed. One evening, Reverend Collier returned. He found Daniel pacing the living room, hammering nails into the walls as though sealing something inside. "Daniel, you need rest," the priest urged. "No," Daniel growled. "Rest is when she comes. If I close my eyes, she'd be standing right there. I can't let her in." Collier put a hand on his shoulder. Daniel flinched violently, nearly raising his gun before realizing who it was. The priest sighed. "If you don't fight this with faith, she'd take you." Daniel's eyes were wild. "She already has." That night, Daniel sat alone, revolver in his hand, staring at the staircase. He whispered into the silence, "If you're coming for me, then come." And in the darkness above, the floorboards creaked as something began to descend. Asterisk, it wasn't just Daniel anymore. Whispers began to spread through Willow Creek. A teenage boy cutting through the fields near the Harker place swore. He saw a woman standing at the upstairs window, her face pale, her hand pressed against the glass. A truck driver passing on the highway late at night reported a figure drifting across the yard, vanishing when his headlights touched it. The stories reached Sheriff Reed, who dismissed them at first as gossip feeding on Daniel's breakdown. But then Deputy Carson went missing. He had gone out one evening to check on Daniel, radioed in around 9 p.m. saying he had arrived. After that silence, no calls, no response. By midnight, Reed drove out himself. The patrol car was still in the driveway, driver's side door hanging open. The farmhouse door was ajar, creaking on its hinges. Inside, the rooms were empty, but Reed swore he felt watched the entire time. Upstairs, in the hallway, he found Carson's flashlight lying on the floor, the lens cracked, beam pointing toward a closet door. Reed opened it slowly, nothing inside but coats. But on the wall, scratched deep into the wood, were words that chilled him to his core. "I am still here." Reed left quickly, his stomach knotted. By dawn, the whole town knew Deputy Carson had vanished without a trace. From that night on, no one dared go near the Harker farmhouse. Not even Reed. The place felt like it was breathing, alive in some terrible way. And Daniel, he seemed to sink further into madness. Neighbors swore they heard him shouting at night, holding conversations with no one. Sometimes they heard gunshots echo again, but no one ever saw a body. The legend of the ghost woman was no longer just Daniel's burden. Willow Creek itself had begun to feel her presence. On the night it all ended, the sky was heavy with storm clouds. Lightning flashed over the fields, illuminating the Harker farmhouse in brief, jagged bursts. Sheriff Reed was at home when the phone rang. A neighbor on the outskirts had heard multiple gunshots coming from the farmhouse. Reed hesitated, his gut twisting, but duty pulled him into his cruiser. He drove through sheets of rain, wipers thrashing, until the farmhouse appeared ahead like a black silhouette against the storm. The front door was wide open. Light flickered inside candlelight, unsteady and strange. Reed stepped in cautiously, hand on his holster. The house reeked of gunpowder. On the living room floor lay Daniel, sprawled on his back, revolver still clutched in one hand. His chest was torn open, blood pooling beneath him. His eyes were wide, frozen in terror at first glance. It looked like suicide. But Reed crouched to study the wound, and something didn't add up. The entry point was angled downward, as though the gun had been fired from above. The revolver in Daniel's hand hadn't been discharged. Every chamber was still full. And then Reed saw it. On the wall above Daniel's body, in thick smears of blood, were words scrawled by a trembling hand. She shot back. A gust of cold wind swept through the house, extinguishing the candles. For an instant, Reed swore he saw her, a pale woman in the shadows of the staircase, her eyes black, her smile too wide. Then lightning flared through the windows, and she was gone. "Daniel." Harker was buried beside his wife 3 days later, but in the weeks and months that followed, townsfolk swore they still heard it on stormy nights, the sharp crack of a revolver echoing across the fields, the man who shot a ghost, and the ghost who did not forgive. The farmhouse stood empty. After Daniel Harker's death, Sheriff Reed locked the doors, boarded the windows, and posted a faded nitrogen monoxide trespassing sign on the front gate. But that didn't stop people from talking. At the diner, old men leaned close over their coffee and swore they'd heard the gunshot again in the middle of the night. Teenagers dared each other to sneak up to the porch, to press their ears against the door and listen. Some claimed they heard footsteps moving inside, long after the house was abandoned. Others said they saw her, the pale woman, standing in the upstairs window, waiting. The town gave her names: the widow of Willow Creek, the woman in white, the ghost who shot back. The stories changed with every telling, but one detail remained the same. Daniel Harker had pulled the trigger on something that should not have bled, and in doing so, he had invited its vengeance. Deputy Carson was never found. His patrol car was towed back to town, left to rust behind the sheriff's office, like a monument to the missing. Reed never spoke of what he saw that night, never mentioned the writing on the wall, but the look in his eyes told people enough. Reverend Collier preached that Daniel's soul was at rest, but even he avoided the farmhouse after dark. Thomas Gray, the stranger who had warned Daniel, disappeared from town as suddenly as he had arrived. Some said he was never a drifter at all, but something else, someone who had been chasing the ghost for a long time. Years passed. Grass grew tall around the farmhouse, swallowing the fences, reclaiming the yard. Windows shattered, the roof sagged, but still the house stood. And still, on stormy nights, people swore they heard it, the crack of a revolver echoing across the fields, followed by a woman's laughter carried on the wind. It became more than a story. It became a warning. If you see her, don't look too long. If you hear her voice, don't answer. And whatever you do, don't raise a weapon against her. Because once you fire that shot, she never forgets. In Willow Creek, they still remember Daniel Harker. Not as the broken veteran who lived alone in a rotting farmhouse, not as the man who lost his wife and drowned in grief. They remember him as the man who shot a ghost and the ghost who shot back. Time moved on in Willow Creek, but the story of Daniel Harker did not fade. It grew, stretched, took root in the soil of the town. Children who hadn't even been born when the gunshot echoed now whispered the tale in school hallways, daring each other to ride their bikes past the farmhouse at night. Paranormal investigators came, drawn by rumors that spread far beyond the county line. They set up cameras, microphones, and motion sensors. None stayed longer than a single night. Every one of them left shaken, their equipment inexplicably damaged. A few never released their footage, claiming the tapes themselves carried something wrong. Travelers on the nearby highway swore they sometimes saw a woman standing on the porch at dusk, staring as cars passed.